Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And a big thank you to RadComms for hosting this rad session. We have alt text for this first slide. It's a title slide reading Abolition Narratives in Fascist Times, how to talk about the Epstein files, prosecution of ICE, and punishment, with a black and white protest illustration of a person holding a sign that reads, it's in color, sorry. If you are looking for criminals, go to the White House and a RadComms logo. So we're at a moment right now where we can choose, we're at a fork. We can choose to go down a path in which everyone works for Amazon while incarcerated, or we can invest in each other and in the community and move forward towards a sustainable and generative society serving all life on Earth. If we believe the people are going to win and that a future is possible where communities control our lived reality, not those who abuse us, then we have to find ways to hold accountable the people doing so much harm right now. At the top of that list are the agents of ICE and the wider Epstein class who are bringing war to our workplaces, schools, and neighborhoods. And then there are the collaborators in both of these worlds, especially the police, who since their inception have existed to enforce harm. University of California press authors Martha Kinsley Huggins, Mika Hartos Fataros, and Philip G. Zimbardo coined the term violence workers in their book of that title. Going forward, I believe it's the clearest way to describe those who enforce the rules of carceral institutions. So, how do we bring accountability and what does that look like, especially if we want a world without prisons? I brought this panel together when I noticed calls on social media for prosecution that were misaligned with the increased efforts in public education on what Angela Davis named the prison industrial complex, which have been happening since 2020. I've pulled some examples here for review. Next slide. Alt text, black background graphic with white outline title at the top reading, problematic take number one. Centered is a torn white paper rectangle with black serif text. When Pam Bondi is finally in prison, I will gladly pay extra taxes to hire someone to walk by her cell at a random time every day and yell the Dow Jones Industrial Average at her. On slide one, we see a typical meme calling for a humorous approach to imprisonment, but it ignores the realities of punishment. Next slide. Alt text. Black background graphic with a white outline title at the top reading problematic take number two. Centered is a rounded rectangle screenshot framed by a red sunburst background. The screenshot headline says, Lone protester at Austin State Capitol. The person stands on the Capitol steps holding a sign that reads, No taxation without pedophile incarceration. A small handle and URL appear at the bottom at Brave New Films and youtube.com/Brave New Films. In slide two, the call for no taxation without pedophile incarceration, an approach for accountability, but what will a cage actually do to bring restitution to victims? Next slide. Alt text, black background graphic with white outline title at the top reading problematic take number three. Centered is a screenshot of a social media post by Dr. Deshane Stokes that reads, Every ICE officer who has broken the law should be arrested, tried, and imprisoned for their crimes. Below the post are engagement icons and counts. In slide three, the call to prosecute ICE agents. We know that local police wantonly murder people every day. In 2025 alone, local police killed over 1,200 people, according to the Mapping Police Violence Project. How can we expect the prosecution of ICE agents when our local police can kill with impunity? Next slide. Black background graphic with white outline title at the top reading problematic take number four. Centered is a TV news screenshot from Fox 9 showing Senator Amy Klobuchar seated in a studio interview with a male host. A large 9 graphic is behind them. A lower third banner reads Senator Klobuchar on efforts to end ICE operations in Minnesota. Along the bottom of the overall graphic is a YouTube link. And in our fourth slide, we have Senator Klobuchar calling for ICE funding to be moved to local police departments. These are the same departments responsible for the murders previously mentioned. Moving these funds will only bring further militarization to already deadly practices. And this is what our conversation will encompass today. We're here to talk about what happens next. Because if we haven't given a thought to and imagined a future without prisons and cages, how can we get there? I don't know about you, but I want to get there as soon as possible. Even if you think your friends, family, and life have not been touched by the prison industrial complex, it has. The system of slavery and bondage is in the food you eat and the clothes that you wear. And in the case of New York State, where I live and where private prisons are banned, it is in the incarcerated labor that assembles and builds the furniture of our schools, public transportation hubs, and state infrastructure. I want to thank everyone who has shown up for this discussion on the future. It is my great honor to introduce our panelists who will lead the discussion today and answer questions at the end. Next slide. Alt text, speaker slide for Andrea Ritchie, co-founder, Interrupting Criminalization, with a black and white portrait of her smiling, RadComms logo in the corner. Andrea Ritchie is a Black lesbian immigrant survivor who co-founded Interrupting Criminalization with Miriam Kaba and the In Our Names Network, a coalition of more than 20 organizations working to end police violence against Black women, girls, trans and gender nonconforming people. Next slide. Alt text, speaker slide for Victoria Law, co-founder of Books Through Bars NYC, journalist, author, with a black and white portrait of her smiling, RadComms logo in the corner. Victoria Law is a co-founder of Books Through Bars NYC, a freelance journalist and author who writes about the intersections of mass incarceration, gender, and resistance. In addition to her own writing, she has been involved with ABC No Rio, an NYC community center for arts and activism since the 1990s. Her latest book is Corridors of Contagion: How the Pandemic Exposed the Cruelties of Incarceration. Next slide. Alt text. Speaker slide for Alex Karakatsanis, civil rights lawyer, founder, executive director, Civil Rights Corps, with a black and white portrait of him, RadComms logo in the corner. Alec Karakatsanis is the founder and executive director of Civil Rights Corps, where he has led groundbreaking constitutional civil rights litigation challenging the scale, profit, and everyday brutality of the U.S. punishment bureaucracy. Alec is also a civil rights lawyer. He is the author of Usual Cruelty and Propaganda and writes Alec's Propaganda newsletter on Substack. Next slide. Alt text. Moderator slide for Priscilla Grimm, organizer, writer, communication strategist. My name is Priscilla Grimm. I am an activist, organizer, writer, and communication strategist whose work bridges grassroots movement building, political education, and independent media. I translate movement analysis into accessible public-facing storytelling, events, and media with a focus on deepening public understanding of how policing and incarceration shape everyday life. I would like to begin today's conversation with Andrea. The organization you co-founded, Interrupting Criminalization, is a movement resource hub offering information, cross-movement networks, learning, and practice for organizers, practitioners, and advocates on the cutting edge of efforts to build a world free of criminalization, policing, punishment, and violence. When you hear accountability in an abolitionist framework, what is it and what is it not? How do you explain that difference in plain language to people who equate accountability with cages?
Thank you, Priscilla, and thanks, RadComms, for hosting this critical conversation. I do want to actually start by explaining why interrupting criminalization exists and how it relates to this question. So, Interrupting Criminalization was co-founded by Mariam Kaba and I in 2018 during the first iteration of this administration, because we understand criminalization as the process through which right-wing authoritarian and fascist agendas and regimes are advanced. It's literally the how of how it works. It's the creation of the us and them, The them being the folks who have no rights that anyone is bound to respect in reality, and to whom once the label of criminal or criminalized is applied, whether as an individual or as a group, anything can be done to that person. And whether or not there's a process to determine that or not is something that people get very hung up on. But whether there's a process or not, once someone is criminalized, they can be ripped from their community, their family, put in a cage, denied access to light, water, food, uh, other humans in solitary for up to decades, and even put to death by the state. And at the most extreme scale, subjected to the genocide that, for instance, the Palestinian people are being subjected to in this moment, where all Palestinian people, from newborns to nonagenarians, are being framed as inherently threatening to a desired social order. Similarly, the same mode is being deployed in Iran, to Cubans, to Venezuelans, to Somali people, to it's just sort of endless in terms of how once a group is criminalized, then in the most extreme form, genocide is the highest form of criminalization, I would say. So for us, we really wanted to highlight that and highlight the central role of criminalization and the importance of um, uprooting it, both in our own selves and our own consciousness and in our practices and in every institution of society, if we are to stop the things that it makes possible, which is what we're witnessing on 10 now. And I think that many people equate criminalization and accountability. And in fact, they could not be more different. Criminalization actually makes accountability impossible in many ways. So, what I would say is that one, accountability is something that you step into, it's not something that you impose. It's something that you move into by recognizing that your actions have not aligned with your values or with our collective values, and you commit to um, making repair, to acknowledging that, to making the person who you did harm to whole to the extent possible. And it is also a collective process. It is one in which all of us consider and take responsibility for the ways in which we have collectively created conditions in which harm could take place. So now, are people like Kristi Noem going to step into accountability? Absolutely not. Does that mean we let her run wild? Absolutely not. We then, if someone is not able or willing to step into accountability, then there are certainly consequences. And the consequence is that one, you're removed from a position to continue to do harm. Two, that you might be asked to make repair or reparations to the people that you harmed. Certainly, there's going to be a process of imposing consequences to stop the violence. And that is the thing that the criminal punishment system does not do. It does not stop the violence, it just adds something to it, and adds more violence to violence. And so I think that's the important piece to think about. The thing about accountability or consequences is that they are not punishment. Punishment is the deliberate infliction of suffering. It is saying someone has done harm and I want them to experience that same harm or 10 times worse. And that is a very much human instinct, but it is not one around which we want to organize our society, because that is the society in which we are living right now. It just depends who's in power, who gets to engage in that process, right? And so what's really important is that we recognize that, and recognize that the criminal punishment system doesn't make accountability possible because it is built around punishment. And so people aren't going to want to step into accountability if what's coming is punishment. And also, um, none of that actually repairs or restitutes the person who's been harmed, nor does it transform the conditions that made the harm possible. And so even if there's one situation where a person is punished, the thing will happen again because it is not about changing society, it is about punishing individuals. And so I think it's really important for us to understand finally that even that process of punishment is a political process, and it is one that is designed to uphold existing systems of power. And so when we think that people in power are going to be subjected to it, whether it's the Epstein class, the state actors who are enacting violence individual ICE officers or police officers, I think the 250 years of history of this country make it clear that that is not going to happen, or it might happen occasionally in an exceptional case in order to justify the system, but it is not actually the function of the system. The function of the system, the criminal punishment system, is to maintain the existing order. And therefore, we will not see the people who are benefiting from and running the existing order be subjected to its punishment and consequences. And I feel like that's the delusion that many people continue to operate in, and it's really important for us to break.
Alec, your book Propaganda unpacks how the police are upheld as the arbiters of safety and security, as public fears are dialed up to the highest levels through news reporting. This primes the public to turn to carceral answers in moments of public outrage, like the recent murders in Minneapolis enacted by federal immigration agents. From an abolitionist perspective, what could or what does meaningful accountability look like besides or alongside of criminal trials, which is kind of, unpacking this question that Andrea just, spoke to.
Absolutely. And thank you for including me in this incredible discussion. And it feels a little bit odd to answer a question about accountability in front of people like Andrea and Victoria, from whom I've, really learned so much about that question. Uh, but I'll give it a go. And in fact, maybe instead of trying to like answer such a huge question, I'll just take one piece of it and just tease out a little bit more of some of the specifics from something that Andrea just said. Which I, first kind of really learned about through some of Mariam Kaba's writing and some of Andrea's writing. But I think that one absolutely vital thing to understand about meaningful accountability in a situation like this is that we have to stop equating accountability with individualized punishment. And Andrea talked a little bit about the punishment component of that, but I want to just follow up on that by talking about some of the kind of individualized conceptions of that. And that is to say, there's this huge thread in modern propaganda, and I go into much more detail about this in the propaganda book. But one of the threads is that it always tries to blame bad things on individual bad actors and individual bad intentions, and to credit good things that are happening with individual heroes and with good intentions, right? It's a dramatic mangling and manipulation of the way the world actually works. And the way we need to be actually analyzing these situations is not trying to get a video recording of the interaction and analyze in this particular shooting, was this the bad guy or was that the bad guy? Or in this other video, like which of the people involved is the bad actor, right? The real question is more structural. What are the institutional arrangements in a society? What are the cultural sort of trends and patterns, attitudes, intuitions, beliefs, behaviors that actually create the conditions that produce all of these interactions together, right? And so the punishment bureaucracy's answer is always trying to find individualized reasons why things happen. But of course, in the sort of longer arc of history, the reason individuals are in these positions to do those things has to do with deeper structural features of our society, like how unequal it is, who has power, what kinds of investments society is making, what kinds of cultural ideas are thought of as normal and common sense. And so let me just be a little bit more specific here. One of the things I talk about in the book is the body camera issue, right? And that's a big issue right now. Democrats are insisting that all the ICE agents be given surveillance cameras. I've actually written a separate piece on the I think the body camera is probably the most effective propaganda campaign in modern police surveillance history. But the crucial piece of that I want to highlight right now is all of this focus on body cameras is focusing on the moment of individual police violence and not on deeper questions of, well, why were the police or ICE in this neighborhood at that moment anyway? What were they doing? Whose interests were they serving? Why do they exist in the first place? Why are they armed? Why do they have this technology? All of these kind of deeper and deeper questions. And when you actually look at the propaganda around police violence, not just ICE violence, but if you look at Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Eric Garner, if you look at what happened after Michael Brown, etc., all the way back through, you see that the police and the punishment bureaucracy have kind of a hierarchy of preference in terms of how they want to talk about these issues. At first, they deny anything is wrong, right? So sometimes they're forced to admit that something bad happened. And in those instances, they try to blame out individual cops. Sometimes, though, as in the case, for example, of Tyree Nichols in Memphis, they're forced to go one ladder up. They're forced to blame a bad squad, like the Scorpion Squad in Memphis, right? Or the Gun Squad in New York. The police are still okay with that, though, right? Because we're not calling into question the entire project of repression in an unequal society. We're just talking about individual squads. Then sometimes they're forced to admit that entire forces are bad apples, like the Ferguson Police Department or the LA PD and the Rampart scandal. Or right now we're seeing this with ICE, right? So this is actually a propaganda technique. It's designed to say to you something like, ICE is an aberration. ICE is bad. It's not this project of policing and repression and state violence. It's this particular force. And in many examples over the last 20 years, local police chiefs, mayors, governors have actually called in the federal government to say, I want you to investigate our whole police force, right? This is a propaganda technique. What they're trying to do is say to you something to the effect of, this particular police force is bad in that it deviates from some acceptable notion of modern policing. And that ignores is that every single police force in the United States essentially looks the same. They police the same people in our society, marginalized people, vulnerable people, people of color, people who are poor, people with certain disabilities, etc. And they ignore the crimes of people who have wealth and power in our society. They have the same policies, the same procedures, the same technology, the same vendors, right? They have the same training programs. So like this is all kind of a part of a propaganda project designed to get us to not ask what everyone has in common and to try to find little differences. And you get the situation where when I go around the country representing my clients, almost everyone in every city I go to assumes that everybody around the country knows that their own police force is the worst one. They're all like, oh well, the St. Louis police, or oh my gosh, well the Seattle police are terrible. Well, oh my goodness, the LAPD are the worst. And what everyone is sort of missing is that they're all internalizing this like bad apple narrative, and really it's the project of what is the role of state security forces in an incredibly unequal world. Well, it's to enforce distributions of wealth and power. And so a lot of to understand accountability, you have to understand who or what is responsible for the harm that you're trying to address. So it's actually not accountability if you give the institutions that created the harm a reward after they do harm. And one of the most central features of liberal propaganda around state violence is that it always uses state violence either by framing it as incompetent or a lack of preparation or a lack of technology. It uses it as an excuse to increase the budgetary investments and size and power of those bureaucracies. So actual accountability in a really meaningful sense is not focused on individual bad actors, although I think, as Andrea says, certainly there needs to be consequences for individuals in terms of reparations and other types of consequences when they engage in bad conduct. But probably the most important form of accountability is withdrawing social investment in the institutional arrangements that produce this mass violence. So reducing the size and power of the carceral bureaucracies and limiting the ability of the profiteers who really invest in and benefit from it, as well as the people who own things in our society who benefit from these security forces generally. Like reducing the size and power of those systems is always going to be the most important form of accountability. So if you're interested in accountability, the place that I would always start is asking, how do we use this incident to reduce society's investment in the punishment bureaucracy? And for me, I start there, and I don't always, that's not the whole story, but it's a very important piece, and it's something that I learned early on from critical resistance and the work of other people on this call.
Terrific. So, Vicky, in your decades of writing and organizing, you have documented, advocated for, and supported people directly affected by the prison industrial complex. How do we respond ethically and persuasively when impacted people or our own base say, no, seriously, I want them prosecuted? What does it look like to honor grief and rage without endorsing the carceral state?
Oh, thanks for that question, Priscilla. Um, I think that first of all, we have to understand that every single one of us has been conditioned by the carceral state, by the criminal punishment system, by what Alec calls the punishment bureaucracy, to think that like it's either prison or nothing. And people want something. So if those are the two options they're given, they're going to be like, well, I want something, so I guess that something will be prison. And I mean, what we see when we're looking at, the Epstein files, like the huge numbers of young women who have been harmed by this, we also see carceral feminism at work. People, carceral feminism is a term applied to the idea that you can only address gender violence with punishment, carceral punishment. If we had more police, if we had more prosecution, if we had more imprisonment for gender-based violence, we could stop that. And we know that is not true. I mean, the latest statistics, show that for every 1,000 sexual assaults, there are like, a fraction of those reported. 50 of those reports lead to arrests. 28 of those arrests lead to a felony conviction, and approximately 25 people are sentenced to incarceration. So even by its own metrics, the criminal legal system is not doing anything to address gender-based violence or sexual assault after it happens, after it has been reported, after survivors have had to tell their story again and again and again to like the cop that takes the call, like the detective that investigates. If they decide to refer it, then they've got to tell their story again to prosecutors. Then they've got to tell it on the witness stand. And so they're forced to go through this again and again and again. And what I've found with survivors is that the criminal punishment system only lets them tell their story and only listens in very limited ways. So survivors want to be heard. So what does it look like to honor grief and rage? First off, it means understanding that they want to be heard. They need to tell their stories in ways that are not directed towards like how do we punish this person, but what is the whole story? Give them that opportunity to be heard because otherwise they're just siloed into that particular moment that benefits the criminal punishment system. So, first is understanding that survivors need to be heard, they want to be heard and listen, and also understand that we're grappling with that punishment or nothing, mentality as you are listening. And then after that, you can refocus the conversation on what do survivors need? Because I mean, when we're talking about policing, prosecution, incarceration, that doesn't do jack shit for the survivors, except give them the sense that something has been done. But does that give them counseling? Does that give them therapy? Does that give them paid time off of work? Does that give them access to better jobs or a better source of income? I mean, what we saw with many of the young women, if not all of the young women that Epstein uh, abused or caused to be abused was that they were from poor households. Oftentimes they were from single parent households. Oftentimes giving them $100 was a fucking bonanza, And so what does that do for changing the conditions that allowed very rich and powerful people to abuse young women who are in very poor financial straits, very limited economic circumstances in which they were not comfortable with what was done to them, but they kept quiet because they were afraid of losing that income. Virginia Giuffre said that she was afraid that he would harm her little brother. He showed her a picture of her little brother, and and she said that she kept quiet and she kept coming because she was afraid of that. Prosecution and incarceration does not stop, that from happening to someone else by someone else, and it doesn't do anything to transform the circumstances in which they find themselves. So refocus the conversation on what do survivors need, and that can be a starting point after listening to them. Like, don't start the conversation with, well, actually, incarceration isn't going to help. Let them get it out because they often have to just live with this, and are not able to just fully express the harm that has happened to them and the trauma that they are holding inside. And then, like you could talk about how if the state is pouring thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars into the carceral apparatus, what does that leave for survivors? I mean, here in New York City, where I am, it's $1,500 per day to incarcerate one person. In the state, it's $315 a day to incarcerate one person. So what could we be doing with $1,500 a day for survivors? What would that look like in terms of housing resources, uh, economic resources? Like here is enough money to live on while you deal with your trauma. Here is enough, like here is childcare. Here is this, here is that, and instead it all just goes into the punishment system. So I would say first listen and then talk about what do you need, and does this punishment bureaucracy actually provide any of it?
Excellent. Thank you so much. Alec, I'm returning to you. So, as we see this outrageously dangerous behavior of ICE agents continue, you spoke a little bit about this before, but I want you to unpack it a bit more if you could. What messages and demands help prevent ICE versus local police from becoming a public relations contrast where local departments look like the heroes? And I mean, we saw this in Minneapolis. They had like police giving out donuts or something to protesters from becoming a public relations contrast where local departments look like the heroes. And how do we communicate that same pipeline of surveillance, detention, and force runs through both of these communities?
I don't purport to have a full answer to that, and I think I've seen different organizers in different jurisdictions doing tactics that are really effective and kind of tailored to their own circumstances and situations. But I think one thing that feels really important is to make sure that examples of police violence and patterns of police violence and corruption and misconduct are centered in your own community, and that the stories of that are getting the attention in your own community they deserve, and that the connections between them and what's going on in other police departments are sufficiently drawn out so that people don't fall into the kind of bad apple or bad squad or bad unit or bad force propaganda. And so I think the first step in all of this is telling these stories and insisting on it never becoming normal, that we never become desensitized to the daily local violence that police are perpetrating. And I don't just mean the shooting that finally makes the news because somebody's been killed. I mean the daily violence of putting metal chains on people's bodies, putting people in cages just because they're poor or because they're an immigrant or because they have a disability or it's just like everything that the police do. So a more accurate recounting of what the local police are actually doing with their time, which involves also really good work that you can do in local court watch programs, just telling the public what is the vast bulk of the work that the police are actually doing in this jurisdiction. That those are both really important places to start. Another thing that I've seen that's very, very useful is helping people understand that beneath the sort of facade of ICE and the facade of your local police department, there's actually a bustling world, right? And this underworld is actually interconnected in ways that are completely inextricable. It's like a forest where underneath all of the root systems are connected through fungal networks, and it's so much more complex than what you see above, what seem to be totally separate trees. Well, actually, underneath all of that is a massive system of corporate profiteering and a massive system of coordination that is actually international. And and so that's why the procurement contracts for ICE and local police departments have almost all of the same companies involved. That's why a lot of those companies share investors, right? It's why the policies and practices and procedures for your local police department are actually not drafted by your local police department, but they're drafted by organized groups that do this for police departments and unions all across the country. So you have to understand the connections. And one of the most important things is understanding that all of the same interests that are pushing these policies with ICE are actually also pushing the same things with your local police. And then a third thing is to just very, very clearly and overtly just describe the levels of cooperation that your local police department is engaging in every single day with ICE. So for all the rhetoric of the commander that stands up there and says, well, I'm disturbed by the thing that ICE is doing in this particular moment in my town. Well, look at what people do much more than what they say. Because I guarantee you that same commander is part of a police force that is coordinated with ICE. Not just with ICE, but with DHS and their fusion centers, with sharing data, with operational issues, and also just like actually literally serving on joint task forces all the time. So I think it's very, very, very important to think about like some of those overarching connections. And then finally, one of the reasons I focus so much in the book on this is we need to be doing some critical thinking, cultivation, and counter propaganda work just more generally about um, the punishment bureaucracy and state violence and repression. And we need to get people like focused a lot less on like the name of the individual police force. It doesn't matter so much like what acronym is on the back of the bulletproof vest, and which agency is handing out this particular gun. Like all of these institutions work together, and they work together to serve the same interests. And so it's very, very, very important that we attack some of the attitudes and mythologies that underlie this propaganda more generally. And that's really why I wrote the book, to try to help people make some of those deeper connections.
Thank you. Speaking of the forest of connections, Andrea, as we all know, all of our grievances are connected. So, what would you say to people and organizations who don't think that abolition is an issue? For instance, why should a climate advocacy organization care about the idea of abolition? What could inclusion into the climate justice space look like?
I think I just also want to, before I take that question on, sort of add on to what Alex was just saying, to not only point people to the collaboration between ICE and police and the similarities in the corporate underbelly that supports it, but to literally point out that the exact same behaviors that people are so outraged by are perpetrated by those very same police every single day. For every example that someone can put out that says, this was a horrifying thing that ICE did, that's above and beyond, it's a rogue agency, I can point to 17 just off the top of my head that regular police have done in the context of regular criminalization and regular policing. And I really think we need, as communicators, to make that point every single time we are putting out or talking about the violence of ICE, to talk about it as part of the seamless violence of law enforcement. And I think we really need to stay away from the narratives that sort of say, these are just Proud Boys who got, a uniform on. It's like, and so are police. There is research by political research associates that shows how deeply embedded white supremacists are in sheriffs. And also there's, the Chicago Police Department, the number of folks who are oath keepers in the department. I think that we just have to really, every single time there's this sort of pearl clutch about ICE, we need to say, and also this is part of the seamless machinery of law enforcement in this country, and you're just seeing it turned up on 10. And you're maybe also just seeing it in spaces you don't usually see it against people that you don't necessarily think it should be normal to experience that. So I want to say that. I also want to point people to some resources from Interrupting Criminalization on how not to be a propagandist, and how to tell stories that undercut these narratives. And to answer your question, criminalization is at the core of all of this, right? And so if you're a climate justice organizer, surely you are quite familiar with the way in which your organizing is being criminalized increasingly and more violently, from no DAPL protests, for instance, to any kind of, climate justice movement, to certainly any kind of animal liberation movement, which were designated terrorists years ago, right? But I think it's important for folks to understand that criminalization gets in the way of every issue they're working on, because criminalization isn't just the passage and enforcement of criminal laws. It is the sort of distribution of life chances according to the value that is assigned to someone. And so, if you care about public housing, then you should care about the fact that criminalization determines whether you can get it or not, or what will happen to you when you don't have it and you're on the street, which will just keep you in a cycle of being unhoused and violated all the time. If you care about access to healthcare, criminalization is how you are being stopped from accessing care, whether it's abortion care or gender affirming care as a trans person, or HIV care, or care as a person who is disabled, or a sex worker, or a migrant, or a pregnant person, or any number of people. So it's really important for us to understand the way in which criminalization operates in every institution of society, not just the criminal punishment system in the distribution of benefits, and of opportunities for safety and well-being, and also the ways in which we participate in it, which is also our responsibility as any kind of movement that's moving towards liberation, to understand that to the extent that we call on it, that we think it can be a source of justice or restitution in any situation, we're fueling the system that we're fighting. And so we really need to find other ways of understanding what accountability, what consequences, what reparations, what societal transformation can look like without feeding the thing that we're fighting and that is ultimately producing the conditions that we're living in.
Terrific. Yes. Thank you. Vicky, so you spoke about this a little bit, but I want you to dig a little bit deeper again. In the public discourse about elite sexual violence and trafficking, what story frames do you see pushing people towards policing in prisons, and what alternative frames would help people see prevention, power, and material support instead? So this is for people who have not been impacted, who see these horrific crimes, and who really want to see some kind, you know, see a future. And what does that look like?
Well, I think the story frame that dominates is, policing and prisons. I mean, we see people calling for prosecution, we see people calling for imprisonment. We saw these slides that you showed earlier, where people are like, oh, if, this person is in prison, I'm gonna, do this, that, and the other, so there is this drive towards punishment. But again, we have to realize that we live in a society where we are told punishment or nothing, so I think that we see story frames all the time that rely on propaganda, rely on this idea that these people are monsters, and if we get rid of the monsters, we solve the problem, and it doesn't. So I think alternative frames, could be like examples of times in which we didn't rely on policing, prosecution, and imprisonment. One of the examples I can think of, which is not elite sexual violence, but is, um, an example of something that happened was, early on in the pandemic in 2020 or 2021, a guy in the Pacific Northwest was arrested and charged with an anti-Asian hate crime, and instead of punishment and retribution and incarceration. Instead, there was a restorative justice process. in which he didn't get to just like sit down and be like, "Oh, I'm sorry, end of story." There was a lot of work involved in that. So he had to, go through some program or some training. The details on this now are fuzzy. I used to know this way back when better. He had to volunteer at an Asian American organization as part of his, making amends and restoration. And then he also sat down with the person whom he had harmed, for a facilitated restorative justice conversation. And I bring this up because we don't hear these kinds of stories. We hear, like, lock this person up. This person is terrible. And I get that people want something. And in the immediate moments, they may very well want punishment. They may want violent punishment. Like there are times that I'm just like, I hope you get hit by a car. I don't actually mean that, like, I hope this person gets hit by a car. Like 5 minutes later, I don't care so much, but in that moment, like, I want a retributive, violent punishment to happen to somebody that I am upset at. But this should not be the way that we actually conduct ourselves as a greater community in society is based on that snap judgment. So I think alternative frames are providing examples of prevention, and that's a harder thing than just going to the survivor, a victim, a victims' rights group, because there are many groups that work with survivors that actually push for restorative justice, transformative justice, not relying on policing and prosecution. And they often are not seen as victims' rights groups to go to. Instead, we see the traditional victims' rights groups where they're just screaming for somebody's head to come off, screaming for somebody to be locked in a cage forever and ever and ever. So I think part of it is shifting that narrative to who else can we talk to? What are other examples of how this has been addressed? And understand that this is not a cookie cutter model. What happens here may not happen there. But having these examples of like, what are some other groups doing? And then also lifting up the groups that are doing this kind of work, saying like, hey, in this area, this group has addressed a somewhat similar incident by doing X, Y, and Z, as opposed to like just calling for the person to be prosecuted and then being mad that they weren't. Um, so I think that is like story frames that make a difference when we are talking about what to do. Um, and we don't see enough of that. I mean, Alec and Andrea have done a tremendous amount of work of lifting up groups and also uh, disassembling, the propaganda narratives that push so much forward, but also it is, pushing for the story frames that talk about prevention, that talk about, like what happens to the survivor afterwards and what do they need, and what is the material support needed for them to keep moving forward rather than the prosecution, the possible trial, the this, the that, the other of these powerful people, looking at what do we do to prevent this from continuing to happen? Because we see that this happens so, so often, no matter how many people we lock away.
Um, so we're about to wrap up here. I have one last question that I would like Andrea to start with. So this question is for everybody. What are two or three North Star narratives you want RadComms members to keep repeating over the years? Narratives that help make abolition feel like common sense and make punishment feel like a status quo that society is outgrowing.
You're going to regret that you asked me that question first, Priscilla, because the first thing I'm going to say is narrative is nothing outside of organizing. And I know that's an unpopular take in this group, but perhaps, or maybe not this group, but generally speaking, in kind of the narrative field. But to me, people are just their opinions, their ways of moving in the world, who they are not changed by words thrown out into the ether. They are changed in relationship and in relationship to material conditions. And so I want people to talk about the things that Vicky was talking about. What makes you safe? What do you need when you've been harmed? And yes, acknowledge People are going to want punishment, but we don't organize a society around that, or we end up exactly where we are. And so instead, to also tell stories of times when things were handled without punishment, without implicating the criminal legal system, where people wanted something different for themselves and the people that they cared about who did harm, and to tell stories of otherwise. Because as Vicky's saying, people hear account of this or nothing, and then you must choose something. And so to really invite people into imagination through example and through asking the right questions about what actually stops violence, what actually creates safety, what actually is going to transform individuals and systems and our society and reflect the social contract that we actually want to be building with each other about how we are in right relationship with each other and with the earth. So that's what I would say are the top charges in the context of creating ways of talking about it and spaces about talking about these things is what our role is, I think, as communicators and organizers.
I do not regret asking you that at all. Thank you. Alec, would you like to take this? What are your 2 to 3 North Star narratives you want our members to take with them?
Well, I'll just be a little bit maybe less inspiring and more directed. I think for me, it's really important to just remind people that there is overwhelming evidence from our society and from every other society in the world that the things that keep us safe, that help us flourish, and when I say us, I don't just mean human beings. I mean all of the plant and animal life in this world. The things that help all, you know, of the world flourish are not guns, cages, and violence. And anyone who argues to use a gun or a cage or a chain or violence has an enormous burden to meet, to show that that action makes anyone, let alone all of us, better in some way, and that there's enormous evidence that it's not going to be comprehensive, but the things that actually determine how much we harm each other in a society have to do with things like the levels of inequality and poverty in a society, with levels of investment in health and wellness and education, and in levels of loneliness and isolation versus levels of connection, in cultural phenomena like toxic masculinity. Um, there's so many different. I'm not being comprehensive, but the evidence is overwhelming that these are the things that actually affect how much we harm each other, and yet every single word and sentence and clause of the mainstream news and the movies and the television about harm and violence is trying to convince you that actually what affects your safety are like little tweaks in the levels of state repression. So like this one prosecutor is too progressive because they only accept 52% of cases, whereas the last prosecutor accepted 57% of cases. Or, it's just it's a total alarm that the punishment for this offense is 16 years instead of 22 years like it used to be. These little tweaks have literally nothing to do with how much people harm each other in a society, and the mere discussion in the news about these things as if they're affected to our safety is one of the deepest forms of propaganda that's competing for our intuitions. And so I think it's very helpful in all conversations to just center with the scientific evidence, which is also consistent with our moral intuitions and what we know to be true, which is that these systems of state violence don't make us safer, and there's so many other things that we could be doing as a society together, led by sort of the mutual care and aid that we provide each other outside of the state, that are the things that actually determine how safe and well and flourishing we can all be.
Thank you. And Vicky.
You make me go after them. Thanks, Priscilla. So to echo Alec and Andrea's points, like people need to remember that the US has the highest incarceration rate, and this hasn't kept us safe. like, and part of this is like, like the media likes to like, do the if it bleeds, it leads. So they're telling you every day about somebody who is bleeding, and these terrible people that are causing people to bleed. But we have to remember that incarceration hasn't stopped harm or violence. It didn't stop all of these elite, powerful people from abusing young women. It's not stopping other people, who are abusing other people. Incarceration is not actually a deterrent. I mean, speaking for myself and probably most people on this Zoom, if not all, when was the last time that you were like, oh, so mad I could punch this person? And then they were like, no, I'm not going to punch them because I'm afraid of policing, prosecution, and incarceration, as opposed to just being like, let me cool down. Like I don't actually need to punch this person in the nose. So incarceration doesn't deter people or it doesn't prevent people from doing harm. It is not the threat of incarceration that stops people from doing this. And then policing, prosecution, and incarceration happens after harm is done, not before. Like there was no preemptive, policing, prosecution, and incarceration for Epstein and all of these elite, people who committed sexual violence. It happened after. And I'm sure that if you talk to survivors and you were like, do you wish that this had never happened? Or do you wish that this person stays in a cage for 500 years? They'd be like, yeah, I actually wish this had never happened to me, that I had not been sexually abused, I had not been assaulted, I had not, had all of these terrible things to be done. I think most, if not all people, prefer not to be harmed versus having the person doing the harm punish them. And then finally, to echo both Alec and Andrea, we need to think about what do we need to flourish? Not what do we need to punish people and make them go away? What do we need to flourish as ourselves, our loved ones, our larger community, whether we like them or not? And then, as Andrea said, we move in that direction and we organize for that, not just storytelling, but, organizing. And that can be, look very different and, like depending on people's capacity and everything else. But thinking of those as the North Star. Incarceration doesn't keep us safe. It happens after harm has been done, and we all would rather not to be harmed. And then what do we need in order to flourish in this society? And how do we move towards that?
Terrific. I just want to give a great thank you to all of you. Thank you so much for joining our conversation here today. Next slide. If we go to, we do have our contact information if people want to get in touch with us in the future. I believe everyone on the call will get a copy of the slide deck, so you'll get this information as well. Thank you everyone for showing up, and thank you to our panelists. I'm so honored that they joined us today.